It's 11 p.m. in Coronado, California. The year is 1941. Jimmy Thach's wife is asleep upstairs. The house is silent except for the soft scraping of matchsticks against wood. And right now, in this kitchen, a Navy Lieutenant Commander is doing something that will save 10,000 American lives. With matchsticks, 3 days ago, a classified intelligence bulletin landed on Thach's desk. It described a new Japanese fighter aircraft that American pilots had never seen before. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, and according to this report, the Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outfight every single aircraft in the United States Navy. American pilots were about to start dying. A lot of them, and Jimmy Thach knew it. So while his family slept, he sat at his kitchen table, pushing matchsticks around like a man possessed. 2 matchsticks representing American fighters, 1 matchstick representing a Zero. Over and over, adjusting angles, measuring distances with his fingers. He wasn't inventing a weapon. He was inventing geometry, and that geometry would become the most important aerial tactic in American military history. This is the story of the Thach Weave. To understand what Jimmy Thach was facing, you need to understand just how badly American fighter pilots were outmatched. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the Navy's frontline fighter in 1941. It was a good aircraft, solid, reliable, and compared to the Zero, it was a flying coffin. The Zero could climb at 100 feet per minute. The Wildcat maxed out at 2,300. The Zero could turn inside the Wildcat so easily that Japanese pilots considered it almost unfair. One American pilot later described it as trying to dogfight a hummingbird with a brick. In range, the Zero could fly over 1,600 miles. The Wildcat barely managed 800. In the early months of the Pacific War, the kill ratio was devastating. For every Zero shot down, the Japanese were destroying nearly 4 American aircraft. American pilots weren't just losing, they were being slaughtered. Now, Navy pilots weren't stupid. They had tactics. The standard defensive maneuver of the era was called the Lufberry Circle, named after a World War I ace. When attacked, American fighters would form a defensive circle, each aircraft protecting the tail of the plane in front of it. In theory, any attacker trying to get on someone's tail would immediately have another American fighter behind him. In theory. Against the Zero, the Lufberry Circle was suicide. The Zero's turn radius was so tight that Japanese pilots could simply fly inside the American circle. They could cut across the center while American planes were stuck on the outside, watching helplessly as their wingmen were picked off one by one. One Zero pilot, Saburo Sakai, later wrote about these encounters. He called them easy kills. He said American pilots were flying in circles waiting to die. The Navy's best defensive tactic was worthless, and no one had a solution. Jimmy Thach wasn't the kind of pilot who made headlines. He wasn't a maverick. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the best shot in the squadron or the fastest flyer. What Jimmy Thach was a thinker. Born in Arkansas in 1905, Thach graduated from the Naval Academy in 1927. He became a test pilot at the Naval Air Station in San Diego, where his job was to push aircraft to their absolute limits. Not for glory, for data. Thach would fly the same maneuver 50 times, recording every variable. Airspeed, altitude, rate of turn, engine temperature. He wanted to know exactly what an aircraft could do, and more importantly, what it couldn't. His squadron mates called him analytical. Some meant it as a compliment, some didn't. But that analytical mind was exactly what the Navy needed, because Jimmy Thach had read the intelligence bulletin on the Zero, and unlike other officers who saw it as a death sentence, Thach saw it as a problem. And problems had solutions. So every night after dinner, after his wife had gone to bed, Jimmy Thach would sit at his kitchen table and think. The first thing Thach realized was that the American approach was fundamentally wrong. Every pilot was trained to outmaneuver the enemy, turn tighter, climb faster, be better. But you can't outturn a Zero in a Wildcat. It's physically impossible. So Thach stopped trying. He started with a simple question. What advantages does the Wildcat actually have? The Wildcat was heavier. That meant it could dive faster, The Wildcat was tougher. It could take more hits before going down. The Wildcat had better armament, 650 caliber machine guns versus the Zero's 2 machine guns and 2 cannons. And the Wildcat had American pilotsmen trained to fight as a team. That last part was the key. Thach pushed 2 matchsticks across the table, representing a pair of Wildcats flying parallel to each other, about 200 feet apart. He added a third matchstick behind one of them, the Zero. In a traditional dogfight, the Wildcat being chased would try to turn and escape. The Zero would follow. The American would die. But what if the American turned toward his wingman? Thach moved the matchsticks. The chased Wildcat turns right toward his partner. At the same instant, the partner turns left toward the chased Wildcat. They cross paths. And suddenly, the Zero pilot who was chasing the first Wildcat finds himself flying straight into the guns of the second. Thach called it the beam defense position. The Navy would call it the Thach Weave. A good idea on paper is worthless if it doesn't work in the air. Thach needed to test the weave against a real adversary. He needed someone good, someone aggressive, someone who could fly like a Japanese pilot. He chose Lieutenant Butch O'Hare. O'Hare was already famous in the squadron for his flying. Fast, precise, unpredictable. If anyone could break Thach's theory, it was him. The test was simple. O'Hare would play the Zero, attacking Thach and his wingman. Thach and his partner would use only the weave. They went up over San Diego in early 1942. O'Hare attacked from every angle, high, low, head-on. He used every trick he knew, every maneuver in his arsenal, and every time he committed to an attack, the weave put him in someone's crosshairs. After they landed, O'Hare walked up to Thach. The younger pilot was shaking his head. "Skipper," he said, "it really works. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." Thach had his proof. The weave worked. But O'Hare was a friend, flying an American plane, fighting by American rules. The Japanese would not be so accommodating. There were problems. First, the weave required absolute trust between wingmen. You had to turn toward your partner at exactly the right moment. Too early, and you'd leave a gap. Too early, and you'd leave a gap. Too late, and your partner was dead. Second, it required abandoning every instinct. When a Zero dropped onto your tail, every fiber of your being screamed to turn away from danger. The weave demanded you turn into it, toward your wingman, toward the enemy's guns. Third, and this was the big one, no one had ever tried it in combat. The mock fights with O'Hare were one thing. Real combat was chaos. G-forces, smoke, fear, radio static, dying men screaming on the frequency. Could 2 pilots maintain the discipline to weave when their friends were dying around them? Thach didn't know. It was beautiful theory, but theory doesn't stop bullets, and Jimmy Thach was about to find out if his matchstick invention could survive the real thing. June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese were coming with 4 aircraft carriers, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Their objective, capture Midway Atoll and destroy what remained of the American fleet. The Americans knew they were coming. They'd broken the Japanese codes. But knowing and stopping are 2 different things. Lieutenant Commander Thach was assigned to lead a fighter escort for Torpedo Squadron 3. His job, protect the slow, vulnerable TPD Devastator torpedo bombers as they made their attack run on the Japanese carriers. He had 6 Wildcats. 6. Against the entire Japanese combat air patrol, the torpedo bombers were flying coffins. Slow, unarmored, they had to fly straight and level during their attack run, making them perfect targets. And Thach knew that the Japanese carriers would be protected by dozens of Zeros. He looked at his 5 wingmen, Dib, Bassett, Cheek, Haas, Macomber. This was it. The weave would work, or they would all die. At 0930, they found the Japanese fleet, and the Japanese found them. More than 20 Zeros dropped from high altitude, screaming down toward the American formation. Thach watched them come. In the first seconds of combat, Bassett's Wildcat took hits. Flames erupted from his engine. He spiraled toward the ocean below. 1 down, 5 left. The formation shattered. Everywhere Thach looked, there were zeros. Above, below, crossing in front, and behind him a zero settling onto his tail. This was the moment. Thach keyed his radio. Ram, he called to Lieutenant Ram Dib. Remember the weave. Dib was 200 feet to Thach's left, with his own zero closing in. On Thach's command, they both turned. Thach broke left toward Dib. Dib broke right toward Thach. They crossed. The zero on Thach's tail suddenly found Dib's Wildcat coming straight at him, all 6 guns blazing. The zero on Dib's tail found Thach in his windscreen. Both Japanese pilots broke off. The zeros came again, more aggressive this time. Weave, cross, fire. A zero exploded under Thach's guns, his first kill of the day. The Japanese pilots were confused. This wasn't how American pilots fought. Americans ran. Americans tried to turn. Americans were easy kills. These Americans were different. Years later, the great Japanese ace Saburo Sakai wrote about this battle. He described a fellow pilot, Nakajima, becoming enraged at the American tactics. Nakajima was a veteran of China, Sakai wrote. He had never seen anything like this. Every time he attacked, the 2 American fighters would swing toward each other. He would fire, but before his bullets could reach the enemy, another Wildcat was coming at him. He screamed in frustration. For nearly 30 minutes, Thach and his surviving pilots wove back and forth above the Japanese fleet. Though the Japanese couldn't solve the geometry, when the Battle of Midway ended, the numbers told the story. VF-3 and other squadrons using the Thach Weave claimed 31 Japanese aircraft destroyed. They lost 5 Wildcats. More importantly, the distraction provided by the torpedo bombers, those slow, doomed aircraft Thach was protecting, had pulled the Japanese Zeros down to low altitude. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, there was no one to stop them. 3 Japanese carriers burned. The war in the Pacific had turned. Thach climbed out of his Wildcat, exhausted, drenched in sweat. The matchsticks had worked. Within days of Midway, every fighter squadron in the Pacific was drilling the weave. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach, another ace, gave the tactic its official name, the Thach Weave. Thach Weave. Thach himself was modest about it. It's just geometry, he told reporters. Any pilot could have figured it out, but they hadn't. At Guadalcanal, Marine pilots adopted the weave and used it to defend Henderson Field against waves of Japanese attackers. Cactus Air Force, they called themselves. They were outnumbered every day, and every day they survived, because 2 Wildcats working together could defeat 4 Zeros working alone. The Japanese never fully solved the weave. Part of it was technical. The Zero's fuel tanks made it a flying bomb, and the weave put Zeros in the crosshairs more often. But part of it was cultural. Japanese pilots were trained to be individual warriors. Glory came from personal kills. Samurai in the sky. American pilots were trained to be teammates. Survival came from protecting each other. The weave required ego to disappear. It required trusting your wingman more than yourself. That was easy for American fighter pilots to understand. For Japanese aces who had spent years building their reputation on solo kills, it was almost impossible. Sakai himself admitted this after the war. The Americans learned to fight as pairs. We never did. By the time we understood, it was too late. The Thach Weave didn't die at Midway. In Korea, American pilots used a modified version against MiG-15s. In Vietnam, the Navy's Top Gun school was founded specifically because pilots had forgotten the fundamentals, including the weave. Once they relearned it, kill ratios improved dramatically. Today, the tactic has evolved into what fighter pilots call the loose deuce and other fluid formations. But the core principle remains exactly what Thach discovered with matchsticks. 2 fighters working together, turning toward each other under attack, each protecting the other's blind spots. Every Navy fighter pilot learns it. Every Air Force fighter pilot learns it. It's in the blood now. Jimmy Thach was promoted to admiral. He helped design carrier tactics for the Cold War. He trained a generation of naval aviators. He was there when jets replaced propellers and missiles replaced guns. But when people asked him about his career, he always came back to the matchsticks. The Japanese had better planes, he once said. Their pilots had more experience. They had every advantage that mattered. But they were thinking like individuals. We learned to think like pairs, and that made all the difference. The Mitsubishi Zero was a masterpiece of engineering. It took Japan's greatest minds years to design. It was defeated by geometry, trust, and a box of matchsticks. Today, 8 decades later, American pilots still call the Weave. And somewhere, in a kitchen in Coronado, an old wooden table still holds the scratches where matchsticks changed history.